Well, hello, this is Grant Goolabon, Deputy State Director with Americans for Prosperity, Pennsylvania, and coming to you as part of our continuing series to educate Pennsylvanians about the constitutional amendments that are on this May's primary ballot, in particular, the two that deal with limitations on the governor's emergency powers. As you know, we're now into year two of the 90-day emergency declarations by the governor. We're on his fourth extension of 90 days on that. And despite, as we've talked about, numerous efforts by the General Assembly to provide input into the process of managing the emergency on behalf of themselves and the Pennsylvanians they represent, those attempts have been rebuffed by the governor and his administration, and so that's why we find ourselves where we are. With me today is State Representative Frank Ryan out of Lebanon County. Representative Ryan, good morning. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great, thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you today, and I appreciate the effort that you're putting into this. These are critical constitutional amendments.
Well, thank you. I mean, again, just by way of brief explanation, the amendments, the First Amendment deals with the length of time that the governor can declare an emergency for. We would limit that to 21 days without express approval by the General Assembly to continue it. The second one deals with whether or not the governor would have the ability to declare a substantially similar emergency if one is terminated by a vote of the General Assembly. We wouldn't be able to do that and be able to just declare the same or similar emergency over again. But Representative Ryan, you representing Lebanon County, you've kind of been at the epicenter of the struggle between the governor and local governments and private businesses and individual Pennsylvanians as far as how the emergency should be managed and how the declaration should be run. Can you tell us about some of the instances of being on the front lines of that and what that's meant in practical terms to the people that you represent?
Absolutely, Grant. I think one of the things that people should realize is when this emergency declaration took place, we were all fairly supportive in the first 2 weeks of the evolution of it. When we found out very quickly that the governor was applying an awful lot of the issues about the emergency declaration, particularly as it affected individual rights and freedoms and individuals' businesses, they were not being careful. They weren't being consistent. As an example, with the business shutdowns, we found the waiver process was completely incoherent. It was capricious at best. The individuals that were trying to use, as we were hearing under the CISA guidelines or the CDC guidelines, it would be one thing for one industry. The same competitor in a different industry was treated entirely differently. So we'd have to get these waivers and they were not equipped for it. So what we found is that under our constitutional republic, the very framework of government taking of your property, either your livelihood or anything like that, was taking place with almost no constitutional challenge to it because of this unrelenting authority that was granted under the Emergency Powers Act and of 1978 and the Disease Control and Prevention Act of 1955. So we found that two of those laws inadvertently contributed to almost a complete suspension of your constitutional rights, and we decided to fight back on it pretty hard, and we did.
No, that's extremely important because, I mean, just as a number of people have said, that the Constitution doesn't all of a sudden stop being in effect just because there happens to be a pandemic out there, and our rights need to be protected, and that hasn't, for the most part, happened in terms of of how the governor's managed this. Now, you talked about the business waiver program. I think is a great example of the arbitrary and evidence-free nature that the governor and his appointees have managed this declaration with. Some of the experiences that individual businesses and families have had in your district. I know that there was, again, quite a bit of pushback and retaliation by the governor in certain ways. Can you talk a little bit about how that went?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I found, I think, probably the most offensive about the entire process is that the business waiver process was not well thought out. And so, as an example, there's a thing called the CISA guidelines, CISA, And basically it's an infrastructure security act. It's a federal program, and it provides guidance on how you do this. Well, there's certain critical infrastructure. Now, I find it a little offensive that government will determine what's essential and what's not essential. I don't necessarily believe, in fact, I know it's not a role of government. I'm a retired Marine colonel, and my responsibility is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. We are not supposed to be subservient to a governor. We're not supposed to be subservient to an executive branch. We're supposed to represent the constitutional rights of people. So what we found in this process is that these guidelines and the alleged science, I remember hearing these comments, follow the science. Well, I did a lot of the right to know requests. We found out there was no science and none whatsoever. In fact, we said, who did you consult with to do these various things? Well, no one. The shutting down of the restaurants. Well, how did you come up with the idea that this was the area where it was being spread? Well, we felt that that was where it would be spread. None of it was literally an executive decision-making process of gut feel. So we pushed back on that. We started to win. And York County was doing the same type of thing that Lebanon County was doing in terms of the pushback. Now, we're a much smaller county in Lebanon County. So in many cases, the governor decided to retaliate against us because we have a significantly lower population than our sister county, York County. Well, we were both very vocal in that process. Other counties were as well, Lancaster County to some extent. And then so the governor retaliated by shutting down some of those businesses or attempting to. And then there was obviously community pushback. We had a situation even with their DA, our former senator who subsequently passed away, Senator Dave Arnold, myself, Representative Russ Diamond. We stood unified that we need to protect the rights of individuals. We do realize that COVID-19 was a pandemic. We do realize it was serious. What we wanted to make sure that that which was effective was put into place, not that which was some social engineering, politically mandated science that came about. I called it an agenda-driven science as opposed to science-driven science. And that caused a lot of people to lose faith and confidence in government, candidly. I think the mask is probably a clear example of that, where don't wear a mask from Dr. Fauci, to wear a mask with Dr. Fauci, to wear 2 masks, to wear 3 masks, get the vaccine. Senator Rand Paul just had an interesting dialogue with Dr. Fauci, and Senator Paul is a doctor.
Yes.
And when you started to look at this, we want to do that which is working. So I often made the comment to the executive branch that if you sat back and took the approach, if we had said to the citizens of Pennsylvania, we're not exactly sure what's going to work, but we think this will, could you work with us? I would tell you that in my county, every citizen would have jumped on board immediately. When you start putting these irrational mandates that were clearly not well thought out. We had a comment as an example, if your stadium was able to hold 2,000 people, you could be up to 20% capacity. If it was 2001 to 4,000, you could have 15% capacity. Well, it turns out if you went to 2001, you could have fewer people in the stadium than if you had 2,000.
That's right.
People understand that. I mean, I'm a CPA as well, and it doesn't take much to do the math. So what we said is, let's be realistic, let's be rational in the approach that we're taking.
No, I think the one thing that the response to the pandemic by the governor's really illustrated is that they're the 2 competing mindsets here. I mean, you have the mindset evidenced by the governor and his appointees that, you know, Pennsylvanians are not capable of making rational, intelligent decisions about how to conduct themselves whenever there's an emergency on and need to be mandated to do, you know, whatever it is that government is telling them. And then there's the worldview that I think has been espoused by you and a number of your colleagues, which is that, as you said, you know, if you come to Pennsylvanians and say that, look, there's an emergency on, there's a lot we're not sure about, but this is what we think we ought to do, and will you work with us on that? That's a much, much better approach. And that's what hasn't happened. And that's what these amendments are trying to bring into the process for this and for future emergencies, to again, to make sure that actual science and actual evidence enters into the decision-making process. And I know that there have been a number of attempts, you know, listening to the debates in both the House and the Senate on the passage of the joint resolution that authorized the amendment, story after story by legislators about how information was brought to the administration from people who were out there dealing on the front lines of the pandemic about what worked and what didn't, and it just wasn't considered at all by the governor and his and those who work for him.
Like you can't possibly imagine. It was amazing. We saw stories. We've got a number in my own district where that occurred. And so as an example, the attendance at schools, the implication that have the unemployment failure in the system about what happened. We still have some people who from a year ago are still waiting to get their unemployment compensation because the system was broken. We found that people that could have worked were not able to. We're finding that right now the inconsistency in what happened, if someone had two jobs and they got laid off from both of them, the unemployment only allowed them to get compensation for the one. Yet it was just absolutely, people were getting pandemic relief checks who were not affected by the pandemic at all, but others who were adversely affected and almost annihilated by the pandemic were basically not assisted at all. Landlords were told that there was a waiver on evictions, which pretty much all of us understand to some extent, but at the same time, that landlord's payment to their bank wasn't waived. The Federal Reserve and the FDIC were still holding the banks accountable for the loan loss reserves on the non-performing loans. We haven't begun to see the ultimate effects of what this has occurred, let alone the effects of pumping that much money into the economy. We're now, between the actions of the Federal Reserve and the federal government, we're looking now somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 trillion in spending and an additional $8 trillion of federal stimulus through the Federal Reserve. Our federal debt is now approaching $30 trillion. Longer term interest rates are already starting on the increase significantly, and it's a problem. And I think the thing that was offensive to me is, I was as a Marine, a former commanding officer of a civil affairs group, and we helped rebuild governments. So I've helped to rebuild part of the Iraqi government. As I know what I'm doing, a lot of us were in the same boat, and we offered guidance and assistance. Combat support hospitals could have been mobilized rather than putting seniors back in nursing homes who were COVID-19 positive, completely ignored. And so what these constitutional amendments are geared to do is to provide that type of consensus. So as an example, I had sponsored a bill last session that basically said that we would establish a coordination cell that would include the legislature. That was kind of dismissed out of hand. The governor recently just announced that certain members of the legislature, both the House and the Senate, would be appointed to this vaccine distribution group because he saw his prior plans weren't working. So that's all we're saying is we're a co-equal branch of government. These two constitutional amendments are designed to provide some limit on the Emergency Powers Act. One of the amendments is designed to fix what I believe was a fatal flaw in that bill that was passed in 1978. It basically says by simple majority, the Senate and the House with a concurrent resolution can overturn an emergency declaration. That's one of the constitutional amendments we have. What the Supreme Court said that House Resolution 836, which was last year's resolution to end the emergency declaration, required a 2/3 veto override should the governor veto and required presentment to the governor. The Emergency Powers Act said it was a simple majority. So the whole goal of this one constitutional amendment is to put that in line with the Emergency Powers Act, that a concurrent resolution can terminate an emergency. So let me give you an example. The governor's had an opioid emergency declaration almost literally now for 3 or 4 years. If he had wanted to, he could have literally shut down the entire economy using that emergency declaration. And no one perceived when the Emergency Powers Act that it would be abused this much. The pandemic is an example. The fiasco with the election in 2020 was Pandemic Emergency Power Act driven disaster that occurred with the general 2020 election. The second constitutional amendment basically says the governor's ability under a emergency declaration is limited to 21 days, and then the governor must come back to get it extended to the legislature. And I think that provides a greater control to say that we've got to have this greater coordination cell that happens. What I was really disgusted by is after all of this, a year, there's two things going on. One, the governor wrote and the Secretary of State wrote the constitutional amendments in such a way that to the most casual observer, it looks like we're hurting the executive branch rather than the fact that it's to give you your power back. So what we're telling people is there's 3 constitutional amendments on the ballot, vote yes to all 3.
Yes.
That's what we're saying is make sure that you recognize if you want your power back as a citizen and to have a balance of the restoration of power, you should vote yes. Now, if you don't believe that, then obviously you're free to vote any way that you would preferably want. The second issue, I think, is something that I think is equally more important, or equally as important, excuse me, that we look at relative to the constitutional amendments. And that's this entire process of whether or not the executive branch should have this kind of a heavy hand in the way a constitutional amendment is written. Now, I think you should be aware that we had one that limited judicial terms and in the age at which a judge had to retire. The Supreme Court didn't like the way that was written, and they ended up taking it off the ballot and made us vote on it again. So the Supreme Court ended up getting the decision that they wanted. That's wrong. The voters spoke to begin with. So now is the time for us to be able to say in Pennsylvania, if you vote yes for these 3 constitutional amendments, 2 of them are dealing with emergency powers. The third one is not. That's an equality amendment, but it's easier to explain to people, just vote yes on the 3 if you want to get your powers back as a citizen of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's been our position as well, is to encourage people to vote yes on all 3 of the amendments. But the points that you made about again, just rather than being a usurpation of the executive branch's power, all this is just rebalancing the power between co-equal branches of government and correcting the flaw that you mentioned in the original emergency declarations law, and putting the legislature back on even footing, and therefore putting the people back on an even footing with the executive branch through their elected representatives in the General Assembly, to be able to say that whenever declaration gets to 21 days, then the legislature has the right to weigh in. And I think that something that's been missed in all this is that the General Assembly could very easily, if there's evidence shown that a declaration needs to continue, General Assembly could very easily vote to say, yes, we'll continue for an additional 21 days. All you have to do is come and make the case that it's necessary, and you've got people that are rational representing the citizens of Pennsylvania, and they understand that if there is truly an emergency that still needs to be met, that we can leave the declaration in place and do what needs to do. But we're also getting the oversight of the General Assembly and the input from them and the people that you represent to make sure that the emergency is handled in the most efficient and effective way possible.
Absolutely. And what it also allows us to do is make sure we get the appropriate amount of funding out to the appropriate agencies simultaneously. But I'll give you an example. The one ballot question, just to give you an example of how it was written. And it was the ballot question relating to the termination or extension of the disaster emergency declaration. That was the simple subject. Here's the way the governor's office, the Secretary of State, wrote it. And I quote, "Shall the Pennsylvania Constitution be amended to change existing law and increase the power of the General Assembly to unilaterally terminate or extend a disaster emergency declaration and the powers of the Commonwealth agencies to address the disaster regardless of the severity pursuant to that declaration, through passing a concurrent resolution by simple majority, thereby removing the existing checks and balance of presenting a resolution to the governor for approval or disapproval." And I wrote this as an op-ed. I said the plain English translation is to correct a flaw in the Emergency Declaration of Act of 1978, which is basically saying that by a simple majority of the House and the Senate, that the governor's emergency powers would be terminated. The governor made it look as if we were having Pennsylvania drive off the edge of a cliff. The second constitutional amendment, which I think was equally as disingenuous, was the Disaster Emergency Declaration and Management was the title. And here's the way the governor's office wrote it, the Secretary of State's office wrote it. And I quote, shall the Pennsylvania Constitution be amended to change existing law so that a disaster emergency declaration will expire automatically after 21 days, regardless of the severity of the emergency, unless a General Assembly takes action to extend the disaster emergency. The governor may not declare a new disaster emergency to respond to the dangers facing the Commonwealth unless a General Assembly passes a concurrent resolution. The General Assembly enacts new laws for disaster management, end quote. And again, the simple English translation of that is, at the end of 21 days, we want the ability to review what the governor's done. That's it. And the way it's written, it makes it look as if it was irresponsible to challenge the governor. And that's what's gotten us into this mess. So if people want the power back that were their duly elected representatives gave them, you want to pass these constitutional amendments. I will tell all Pennsylvanians, if you decide that you were disgusted with the 2020 vote, and you decide not to vote, I will tell you, you are voting, by not voting, you are in essence voting to suspend your constitutional rights at the whim of one person. And I would tell you that if you do that, then you should be prepared to not go back to someone else later on and say, why have you done this to me?
Exactly. And I think you make a great point about the fact that right now the power is all in the hands of one person. And that was not the way that our republic was ever designed to be run in an emergency or non-emergency situation. No matter how well-intentioned that one person may be, concentrating all that power in one individual is dangerous. And we've seen, what the end result can be if you have someone in power that is intending on doing whatever it is that they want to do, regardless of whatever additional evidence or input that may be presented to them. But
I encourage all of my friends, regardless of whether you're progressive, liberal, Democrat, Republican, super conservative, libertarian, you want to vote for these amendments. And I'll tell you what, we just recently came out of a very contentious 2020 election. So for my friends that were supportive of President Biden or someone else, just remember, if this same bill was in effect at the federal government level, if you were supporting President Biden, it would be like saying, I'm going to give President Trump unilateral authority over you and all the states. Or for those friends of mine that might be more conservative, that believe that with President Biden, how would you want to have where President Biden had 100% control over you and required a 2/3 majority in the Senate and the House in order to be able to overturn an executive power decision? You wouldn't want that power to be in the hands of either group. And I would tell you, this is a good common sense solution for everyone, regardless of your political persuasion.
I think that's so important to remember, that this is not ultimately a partisan issue. This is an issue that cuts across every partisan line. And also, it's very important to remember that since this is a primary where ordinarily it would only be Republicans or Democrats voting, all individuals who are registered to vote, regardless of party, regardless of independent status, if you're registered Libertarian, Green, whatever you may be registered, you can vote on these amendments. And as you said, Representative, it's very important regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, because ultimately this is about how we're governed and who has the power to make decisions. And continuing to keep that power in the hands of the people and concentrating it in one individual's hands. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely. And I think that really does boil down just to that particular issue. Do you want the ability to have a co-equal branch of government? And just remember, if you decide you don't care about that kind of thing, then the consequences of that decision will be yours and yours alone. This is truly in the hands of the voter. It's in the hands of the people to make the decision of what type of government they want. And I'm imploring you to have everyone who's watching this to realize that it's your decision and your decision alone. We didn't make any decision in the legislature other than to give you the right to choose your own destiny. And now the decision is yours when you go to the ballot box on May 18th, 2021.
That's right. Truly, the people will have the final say, and continue to come here to Americans for Prosperity Pennsylvania, Final Say PA, to get more great information like this and to talk to more leaders like Representative Ryan about what they've done and what they're going to continue to do to fight on your behalf. Representative Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. This was terrific. Thank you.
Grant, thank you so much. I do appreciate it. Again, give my best to everyone. I appreciate you.
Certainly will do that. Thanks again. Well, again, everyone, this is Grant Goolabon, Deputy State Director with Americans for Prosperity Pennsylvania, encouraging all of you to stay involved. Check out our site for our iVol petition, make your voice heard, and make your voice heard on May 18th. Thank you and have a great day.